Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Clemons, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thanks for joining us today for these important conversations, Climate Under Threat. This is the fourth program in our Aspiration and Resilience series, where we've been exploring the aspirations of Arab youth and why we in the United States should care. Today, the topic is climate. It's the world. It's the health of the world. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsor, the Embassy of the United Arab Emirates, for making this series possible.
How did we
in an
start this
ever-connected
without an
world,
intro?
climate change is a collective threat requiring global solutions. The new administration in the United States has signaled that its intention to prioritize action on climate change and the environment. What could that signify for the Middle East, one of the most climate vulnerable parts of the world? Countries in the region that have traditionally relied on an economy supported by oil and gas are exploring post-carbon technologies and diversification of industries. What's the future of renewables in the Middle East? How do these economies reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Outside of energy initiatives, how is the region addressing overall impact on the environment? And what are the implications of climate change on security and instability in the region? And I got to tell you, it is a big deal in that region. What are youth from the region doing to mitigate further damage, and why should Americans care? We have a fantastic lineup of speakers, including members of Congress, a representative of the Office of the Climate Envoy from the UAE, climate and environment experts, and many young professionals. Before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag #TheHillClimate. We are broadcasting live and we'll be taking your questions throughout the program. If you experience any trouble with the live stream, they say refresh the page. It never works for me, but I hope that fixes your problem. Our first guest is a member of the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works. He is the co-founder of the Senate Climate Action Task Force and helped form the bipartisan Senate Oceans Caucus. Representing Rhode Island, the ocean state, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse joins us now. He's made acting on climate change and protecting the environment one of many important pillars of his tenure in the U.S. Congress. Senator Whitehouse, thank you so much for joining us today. Let me just come out of the box. You know, in November of this year, we'll have the next UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow. Or I'm told Glasgow, so my apologies to the Glasgowians. But my question
Glaswegians.
is... there you go. My question is, what does this country need to do to get itself not only back into the Paris Climate Accords, but to become a leader, to take real steps that matter? And what are some of the other stakeholders going to do to make this Glasgow meeting something that moves us forward?
Well, the Biden administration has done a lot already by teeing up the importance of this issue, speaking about it constantly, and putting somebody who's as climate motivated as John Kerry in charge of the international side of American climate policy, teeing us up for Glasgow. So I'm very excited about what we've done so far. Unfortunately, after 4 years under the previous administration, basically under the thumb of the fossil fuel industry, we've had significant damage to our credibility. And I think it's going to be very important for Congress before the Glasgow conference to have passed significant climate legislation. And the good news is that President Biden has targeted Build Back Better, the bill that we hope to pass this summer before Glasgow, as a vehicle for very big things on climate.
You have described yourself, Senator Whitehouse, as a candle in the darkness in past years when it has come to climate action, dealing with carbon. You and I, I'm going to tell the audience, we've known each other a very long time, and I can attest that that was true. You were a candle in the darkness. Has that candle spread? Do you find that there are many more of your colleagues up there that are prioritizing this agenda in a credible way, not just a check off the box way, but in a way where they're actually going to line up with you and try to take real action?
Yeah, it's getting there. I think you see Republicans increasingly understanding that their climate denial posture was completely untenable, is completely untenable, and they're trying to figure out how to work their way through it. You've got a fossil fuel industry that is seeing the prospect of collapse and beginning to understand that managing for that is more sensible than ignoring that. And you've got Democrats, particularly those who went on the campaign trail on the presidential circuit and saw how important this was to Democratic voters and to the public. And so there's been a real rekindling of interest. But I think the most prominent thing has been the emphasis that the Biden administration has put on this. I think that has been the thing that made me feel I could step back from my regular climate speeches, and I didn't have to worry about being a candle in the darkness now that dawn was breaking.
Look, I've just finished reading Daniel Yergin's new book, in which he said Paris and that many new technologies in the renewable sector are real game changers, but that our dependence on various fossil fuels is going to remain in place for a long period of time. I'm just interested in how you think about this. There are oil and gas and coal states like New Mexico, West Virginia, Wyoming. There is an oil and gas industry out there. And today we have the United Arab Emirates, which has made a lot of its largesse in the oil and gas sector. What should we expect in terms of responsible steps where the oil and gas industry and oil and gas states and oil and gas countries, what are the kinds of steps you would expect to get them on the right side of the equation when it comes to approaching climate responsible policies?
Well, I think the first thing that those places need to do is to take a look ahead and see what they think the future of the fossil fuel industry is going to be. We've seen the leading edge of the collapse of the fossil fuel industry in coal, which is dirtier and more expensive than other fuels. We've seen a huge shakeout in the oil industry just from the pandemic, and a much bigger shakeout warned of by pretty much everybody who looks at the industry. And natural gas is not far behind, particularly with respect to its methane leakage. So if this is an industry that is headed for a cliff, then governments that are highly dependent on that industry need to be responsible about how you manage that transition. And there are ways to do it. I mean, Wyoming is basically a petro-socialist republic funded by the fossil fuel industry, but it also has enormous assets in wind and in solar if the transmission can be built to get that out onto the general grid. And places like the UAE have huge now financial footprints and service footprints and a lot of reserves built up from their past oil and gas exploration and production, so that they can transition quite effectively. But if you ignore it, the danger of being caught in a really dangerous crash is very, very real. And governors in Wyoming and the Dakotas and Oklahoma and states like that, just to be responsible, they need to see that coming.
Now, you work with Senator John Barrasso and Senator Joe Manchin, who are the chair and the ranking member of the Energy and Public Works Committees, both at Wyoming and West Virginia. I sort of noticed that, myself, Joe Manchin's aperture on what kinds of energy options are out there has widened. Is that your impression?
Yep.
Do you think he has got to do more? Where do you think the opportunities are with that Senate committee as you look forward?
I think he's eager to do more. First of all, I like both Joe and John very much. John I've worked with a lot across the aisle. He's very, very bright. He's a medical doctor, and I think he really wants to do the right thing. He also has the state that, as I said, is essentially funded by the fossil fuel industry. So, he's got to answer to a Wyoming legislature that is going to say, hey, wait a minute, where did all our revenues go? And he's in a position from Washington to be able to deliver for Wyoming the plan B when the inevitable crash in the fossil fuel industry takes place. And I think he's wise enough to see that possibility. And I think he's going to be cautious about protecting his home state interests, as he should be. But I think that's the conversation we need to have. How do you safely negotiate this transition and bring as many people along? How do you bring along Joe Manchin's basically massacred coal industry? How do you help those individual miners? How do you prepare the Western states for the shift that everybody knows is coming? And I think you can do it through a significant piece of climate legislation.
Sheldon, one of the things that's been most disturbing to me this past year is the politicization of mask wearing. We have a lot of young people. Part of today's program is about youth and what they should be doing. How can we keep the climate topic from following that same track that you're either, you're pro-climate or you're anti, you're pro-pollution? I'm just interested in whether you've developed any insights around youth and action and how to, essentially create a workable middle where we don't see climate politics, suffer the same fate as we've seen with mask politics?
So first, young voters and young activists have been unbelievably important in this space. They're not going away. They're going to continue to be powerful and important. So I think that's a very solid part of how we solve this. I see the politicization around climate slightly differently, because when I got to the Senate for my first 3 years, this was not a partisan issue. This didn't become a partisan issue until Citizens United let unlimited money into politics and turned the fossil fuel industry loose on Congress and allowed them to batter the Republican Party into a state of fossil fuel submission, even spooking people like John McCain, who'd run a very strong climate platform as a presidential candidate, off of the issue, and punishing members of Congress like Bob Inglis, who wouldn't bend the knee. So we're now in a position in which the rest of corporate America is starting to see the really grave harm to their business models if we don't get ahead of this. And that means that they're starting to get ready to show up in Congress and push back on the fossil fuel apparatus. And if Wall Street and big agriculture and the consumer sector and big tech show up in any kind of serious intention or intensity, then they can offset this terrible pressure from fossil fuel that has squelched bipartisanship for a decade. And the market and the warnings and the threats are starting to force that. So I think in the natural course of events, you're going to see bipartisanship begin to re-emerge. But we just got to rush it because time is really short for us.
I'm going to squeeze in one last question, Sheldon. You and I were in a conversation with a fellow from the Commodity Futures Trading Corporation, and they were looking at way you price in risk on violent weather. Incredibly interesting to me, because when you begin asking how do we go from a boutique topic to getting scale, big finance matters. Penalties essentially where risks on climate are being built into investment algorithms. I'm just interested in whether you see with sovereign wealth funds, with the Larry Finks of the world, the CFTC, do you feel that this move is substantial, or do you think it's still greenwashing?
I think it's both. There's a very substantial element to it, and that needs to grow. I think the CFTC's new climate risk group is going to be very helpful. I think the Securities and Exchange Commission moving in strongly will be very helpful. I think it's the Biden administration's intention to mobilize every financial regulatory agency to take account of this risk. And it's hard to fault them for it, because on the private side, banks and big financing entities like BlackRock are doing the exact same thing. So I think there's going to be a tectonic move in the financial sector on this that's actually overdue.
Well, look, just finally, Sheldon, when I was thinking about the filibuster debate, where that goes, I don't know if they'll change the filibuster rules or not, or whether they'll make it, such. I know I've read your comments that you have to go down on the floor and you've got to stand with your filibuster and give a speech. I actually thought it would be rather cool to hear you go down for 12 hours and talk about climate and the filibuster. Would you be willing to do that?
I could do it, and I wouldn't have to repeat myself.
Well, listen, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Steve. Good to be with you.
And listen, I just want to take a quick moment to thank the senator. We had an editor here, Erica Nidowski, who went on to work for an environmental group in Rhode Island, became very close to Senator Whitehouse. She passed away a few months ago, and the senator wrote an incredibly beautiful testimonial to her work. So thank you, Senator. Really appreciate your words and thoughts today.